Susan, and on behalf of myself and Flavia, who you might have met on your way in, and Central Institute of Technology, who are our sponsors, I'd like to welcome you to your Green Drinks. Tonight we have 3 speakers who are going to talk about the Perth Waterfront Development Project. One of them is Ralph Stanton. He's an inaugural member of CityVision, which has been formulating alternatives for Perth foreshore. We also have Sue Graham-Taylor, who works as a historian and researcher, and has been researching the history of the Swan River. We also have Mike Bamford, who's a consultant specializing in fauna investigations for environmental impact assessment. And I'll tell you a little bit more about each speaker in turn as they go ahead and give us their presentations. So just to remind you, if you could please put your phones on silent if you haven't already. If you haven't already found the loos, they're outside, just to the left. We're going to run for about an hour. And in the hour, each speaker is going to share with us their knowledge for 10 minutes. At 8 minutes, just so they know, I'm going to make this sound. So they know they've got about 2 minutes to wrap up, and I'll make it again twice at 10 minutes. And that's just about done. Also, at the end, we'll have our more informal part of the evening, which is outside. We'll have some drinks and some nibbles, so please stick around for that, and we'll continue the conversation. Lastly, I just wanted to ask everyone if we could please keep this as a very respectful and mature conversation. I know that there may be people here who have different points of view and opinions, and that's wonderful, and please share them. But let's just do that in a very genuine, respectful way. And also, let's be concise, because we're going to have about half an hour for discussion, so that way we can get as many people involved as possible. All right, with that, I will introduce the first speaker, Ralph Stanton. Oops. Ralph is a qualified architect and town planner. He's responsible in the past for large-scale urban development schemes and Perth regional town centre plans. Ralph is an inaugural member of CityVision, which is a voluntary, non-partisan advocacy group that has been formulating alternatives for Perth's foreshore since 1988, so quite a while. Ralph is engaged in many of CityVision's projects, especially ideas for Perth Waterfront. Today, he is also an exhibiting visual artist. So welcome, Ralph.
I should say that I'm not here as an advocate of the current scheme. I'm not here as an advocate of the current government scheme because CityVision's been around for a long time and started the idea of doing something on the foreshore way back in 1988. Now, you may not like that, but one of the things that we were involved in was the idea that the foreshore may have some development, not potential for commercial development, but for public use and for civic uses of one sort or another. That was in 1988, that led in 1991 to an international competition run by the Perth City Council. And you can see there that this idea of, this is one of the entries, only one of many. The idea of building out into the water from the central city started to take effect way back over 20 years ago. We started to think, well, you've got to be careful what you wish for because something's happened which you may not always care about. Now, this was the city council itself then went into some looking at the different ideas. This was when the advent of the railway, of the Mandurah Railway went through the city, and Perth City Council started to look at all sorts of different development ideas for the foreshore. Some of which, this is only one of several, of many. But you can see that they kept the Esplanade Park and the Riverside Drive intact. that led later on to the state government taking an interest and began to address the issue. They then developed a sort of guideline plan, indicative concept plan under Land Corp, and they also kept the Esplanade more or less intact and started building out here as well, in front of the convention centre. That in turn led to, in 2007, what they called a peer group. Various architects and planners were brought together to develop a sort of guideline scheme again, and that also kept the Esplanade, but started to build out along here and had no development out here. And then the government engaged consultants who completely ignored all of that, came up with this plan, which you may remember a few years ago, the sort of Dubai on Swan. And there's the Swan.
Oh.
And they literally dug up the Esplanade. Now, we at CityVision were all the time sort of trying to develop some ideas and some sort of principles, and we thought that some of the principles that should be followed would be to do with respecting the Kings Park view and the landscape and the Mounts Bay and the Esplanade Park and the foreshore, and also recognising to get strong southerly winds coming right into that inlet, and also here's the wind rose. It shows you this is the wind rose from that area. The overshadowing, tall buildings are going to overshadow because the sun still rises in the east and goes around to the north and sets in the west, and you can't avoid shadows from tall buildings. And so you should be setting the buildings back under a line which represents the winter sun, lowest sun in the winter, and so there won't overshadow anything there. And CityVision came up with a plan which you may or may not like. That attracted the attention. Of the new government, and we were asked to come and talk to Mr. Barnett and Mr. Day about our ideas. And we had continued with the idea of not closing Riverside Drive and of retaining a fair proportion of the Esplanade Park, not building over here. And you know, if you're going to do this, do it with a little bit of care. But they again came up, they used the same architects who came up with a new version of the plan we showed before, but instead of circular buildings, they're now square. And they now look like this. And this was published in the paper not long ago, a couple of weeks ago. And it shows you those tall buildings that they're building without any shadows. They're sort of ghostly buildings, which, and this looks like sort of Miami on Swan now. We've moved from Dubai to Miami. And yeah, so we've got some really, that's the site over here. Now the big issue I've been asked to talk about tonight particularly is the question of access, traffic and access. Now that's the North Bridge Link, that's the East Perth Extension Gateway thing, and this is here, the scheme we're looking at now on the waterfront. Now there's 150,000 square metres of new office space going into those big buildings, and so many thousand people will come in, and the traffic and public transport system will be under enormous stress with all those new developments there. Now, the government does have schemes for improving public transport, and but at the same time they're going to be cutting Riverside Drive, and the public transport will be under enormous stress. So that's an issue. Now we can see here these tall buildings, these are schematic buildings that the government architects, planners and architects have put up. They're big decks of car parking under here, And these big buildings here, they cut the road across there, and you'll have to drive around that way to get around. And those yellow blocks are development blocks, and there's the new inlet. Now, in terms of traffic and movement, the whole of the city must be seen to sort of in a way as an organic, like an organism. It moves, and people have to move across it, whether by public or private transport. This is a key link across from east to west, and also from north and across to northwest to southeast, and people coming in this way and going that way, right across. And Riverside Drive itself has no real alternative. What will happen if it's cut will be the forcing, if you like, of traffic both into the CBD and around its periphery. So instead of improving traffic flow, we'll have more and more land use, more and more development on the waterfront site there, and attracting more people to that location. And we're actually slowing down and diminishing your access. Just as an idea, this is just looking at, say, morning peak movements from east to west, from east to west. And Riverside Drive allows people to come down off the freeway and up into this part of East Perth, at the east end of the CBD, or along this way and up into West Perth and what have you. And if you cut it, you're going to have them wending their way through Big Park and into the new tunnel, which is going to be widened, but you've still got to get out of the exits, which are clogged, and into West Perth and so on, or into the already narrowed streets of the central area. And you could use these little diagrams and look at all different aspects of east and west traffic, north and south traffic. It's just going to be a quagmire. Just another little view, that's from Kings Park. That's what it's going to look like with the new buildings one day, like that. Now this was done by some people working for the City Gatekeepers group. Just showing what the volume of those buildings. We don't need big buildings in order to get an attractive waterfront, exciting place to sit and drink coffee and what have you. These are an alternative plan produced by the City Gatekeepers, and I advise you, if you're interested in this issue, to look at the City Gatekeepers site. It's called citygatekeepers.com.au. They've got a whole lot of issues like this. This is a new plan produced by CityVision. Shows you a much softer development with still keeping a fair whack of the Esplanade, some of the heritage buildings, much lower and less dense buildings, and many more public buildings. You know, we're giving up a lot of public land here. Why don't we have civic developments? And whatever these may represent, a new museum, a new lyric theatre, all sorts of uses of that sort, which in a way have a call on public space, which private and commercial development doesn't have. There we are, I've come to the end. Good timing. And here's just a view, a three-dimensional view, showing perhaps a hotel and sort of, except some buildings stepped back, and public use here maybe of one sort or another. So that's my talk.
Thanks for that, Ralph. Next up, we have Sue Graham-Taylor. Sue's a PhD in history from Murdoch University. She works as a historian and researcher. Sue was employed by the Western Australia Museum from 2000 to late 2007, when she was awarded the State Library's Battye Fellowship to research the history of the Swan River. She has published books and articles on aspects of Western Australian history and politics. As a history curator, Sue is now working on a range of projects both for the WA Museum and for Claremont Museum. Welcome, Sue.
Thanks, Susan. My viewpoint will be more from a heritage point of view, and this shows the typical view that we see of Perth. You know, the Swan River lies at the heart of Perth. It was the reason for the establishment of the Swan River colony, and photographers and artists alike have depicted Perth from this spot since the earliest days of settlement. And writers have described the beauty and charms, and this view has given us our sense of place. And the future, we've just seen that picture of the white buildings, and the catch cry of this project is the city, the river, together again. Few people have actually described the reality of everyday life for the early colonists. Perth was located on a sandy slope, bordered by shallow, muddy, very smelly waters to the south, and hemmed in by a string of shallow lakes to the north. The area in front of Perth was used for transport, and it wasn't long before colonists complained about the lack of any space where they could undertake recreation. In 1863, the West Australian called for a recreation ground to fill in the space between the two jetties and protect the embankment by a river wall. They suggested that it was perhaps the only colony that didn't have any piece of ground suitable for recreation. And so the colonists got together and agreed that they could solve the problem by reclaiming the area between the Barrack and William Street jetties. In 1867, at huge expense, I think it was about the state budget, £3,000, they imported this dredge from the UK, the Black Swan. It wasn't very suitable and it didn't work, but it started digging up, and the fill that they weren't able to dredge in the river because its buckets were in the centre and it was too shallow. So they had to start digging, and they were putting ash and all sorts of things were put in as fill. So you can see the development there taking place. By 1896, that was the state of the development, and the call for then was for a recreation ground to encourage manly pursuits. And exercise does much to counteract vicious habits and propensities. So the land was handed to the Perth City Council by deed of grant in 1880 from the Governor. He said it was for the free recreation and enjoyment of the people forever. It was named the Esplanade Recreation Ground in 1885. And you can see there that it really wasn't very well developed at that stage, 1885. You can see there's more development there. The city baths in front attracted a lot of people. The recreation ground, the Esplanade, yeah. So this piece of land has been used since 1880 for all sorts of community functions. Every governor who arrived here. Governors were farewelled, troops met before they went to war, they were welcomed home, there were unemployment rallies, secession rallies, responsible government was declared there, not to mention every Anzac Day since 1916, except for yesterday. 1905, they did some more improvement, and it's interesting to see there, they wanted a straight line all around the river, and it actually was the Supreme Court judge who campaigned against this straight line. The argument was that nature had been a bit messy and they had to improve and fix up what was there. And Barrack Square, 1905. The Esplanade Reserve also houses the 1928 kiosk. These are just some of the things that have been held on the reserve. The Esplanade Reserve holds the kiosk, change rooms and toilets, that were built to replace an earlier facility. Then there's the Florence Hummerston building as well, which is now a Chinese restaurant. And these important heritage listed buildings will be dismantled. The bricks are going to be numbered of the restaurant, and then it will be stored until they can find somewhere to actually put it. They found that it didn't actually fit in Supreme Court Gardens where it was proposed to go. So it will lose its connection with the site and its heritage significance. You can see America's Cup Welcome 1983. There have been some huge, very important functions there. With the construction of Riverside Drive from 1937, Perth lost all its warehouses, its administrative buildings, its boat building facilities, its customs facilities, and its markets. This was once a very vibrant area of Perth, and it's now covered with the bus port, the convention centre, the freeway interchange, and more recently with the construction of the underground railway station that ensured the disappearance of the last remnants of the jetty structures. The Esplanade Reserve is really all that we have left in terms of Perth's early waterfront heritage. Can we afford to lose it? The waterfront project will destroy the reserve to create an inlet, and the banks will be sold to private developers. This has been in community hands since the earliest days. It was demanded by the community and even paid for by the community. And you can see there what happened when Riverside Drive went through and destroyed the last remnants of the waterfront heritage. So this proposal doesn't actually recognise the land that it's seeking to develop. Every vestige of heritage value will be eradicated, while the control of the land, this important now heritage listed place, is passed to private developers. Perth has actually got a history of destroying heritage. The Esplanade Reserve is a remainder and a reminder of our city's past. It served the needs of the first settlers and those of succeeding generations. The heritage status of the Esplanade should really be at the heart of any development. There's no denying that something needs to be done to link the city and the river, but really we need to ensure that future generations are proud of what we have and how we've kept our sense of place while we're developing our future. Yeah, I think we can probably talk about afterwards some of the environmental impacts that will come as a result of the dredging, because we know what's under the land, and we know that it will have significant impacts. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sue. I think that those pictures were really interesting. When else will we get a chance to see those? I don't know. So thank you very much for sharing those with us. Our last speaker tonight is Mike Bamford. He's been working as a consultant since the mid-1980s, specializing in fauna investigations for environmental impact assessment and to meet conditions of approval, such as monitoring of impacts and monitoring of rehabilitation. Mike is a regular guest lecturer at Curtin and Murdoch Universities on a range of topics including fire ecology, techniques of animal sampling, land care, conservation issues, and the origins of and evolution of Australia's fauna. In addition, Mike has been writing weekly wildlife essays in the West Australian for 5 years. It's a big effort, for which he was awarded the Alex Harris Memorial Prize for Science Journalism. Mike became involved in waterbed studies on the Swan River in 1980 and continues to count birds at several locations on the water regularly. Welcome, Mike.
I didn't think you'd lead all back. So I'm left-handed, so it's not hard to do this. Okay, so My presentation, excuse me, going to be slightly different. Oh, and my wife Mandy's here as well. This is a joint presentation, so if there's any hard questions, I'll direct them to her. Yeah, my interest in the Swan River is about water birds, and when I was asked to give a talk, I thought, well, I'll give a general talk about water birds and probably leave you with a bit of a question at the end about where this proposed development fits in with the water birds of the Swan. And there is a link there. A lot of those photographs you've seen, in fact, almost all the images you see of architects' designs of what this development's going to look like, there'll be a couple of swans tucked in the corner somewhere. And I wasn't asked to prepare a report last year on how to integrate water birds into this development. And believe you me, it wasn't easy. So, my talk is water birds on the Swan. Very briefly, it's been a long association of human beings and water birds on the river. You can read that very quickly. Some of the history is quite interesting. Obviously, the Noongar people had a very close association with the river. Perth water was a hunting ground. Flaming, of course, sailed in, saw these really weird swans that were black, which wasn't quite right, and so named it Swan River. Baudin, the French explorer, or the captain of the French expedition in 1801, noticed swans. Charles Fraser, just before settlement, commented on the abundance of aquatic bird life on the river. And there's a theme that keeps on coming up in history, the abundance of aquatic bird life on the river. He also predicted their demise, which was very progressive of him. Swans are so important to the Perth community that as early as 1890, our society was importing black swans from eastern Australia, pinioning them, which means they cut off one of their wings, or part of one of their wings, so they can't fly away, and releasing them on Perth water. So there will be swans on Perth water, so 122 years ago. And on a broader scale, and I'm going to talk a lot broadly about the river, not just the development we're talking about tonight. The Swan Estuary is actually recognised under the Ramsar Convention as a site of international importance. Mainly for a little migratory bloke called redneck stint, which you probably wouldn't notice unless I pointed them out to you because they're about that big. But they breed in northern Siberia, so they're pretty cool. Well, everyone else had historical photographs. That's my best one. I don't know who took it. It was given to me by a guy in a photo shop who said, "You're interested in the Swan River? Take these." He found them in the back of the drawer. But that's the, now this bridge being constructed in the late 50s, about when I was born. So early on, the Perth water was used for hunting and fishing and shooting, quite literally. Swans and other ducks and waterfowl are flightless when in molt. They gather on large bodies of water where they feel safe, which means in a small boat with a club in your hand, you could hunt them. And that's what Europeans did during the 19th century. After that, of course, Sue's introduced the whole idea of tidying up the shoreline, making it nice and straight, as it should be, not like nature intended. And of course, what better thing to do with the foreshore around the Swan River than to dump rubbish there and cover it up with sand. Burswood Island, South Perth, Alton Cove. The bit of my bio that wasn't mentioned was that in about 1965, from the South Perth rubbish tip in here, I attempted to sail across Perth water on a mattress. We didn't make it. What does this mean for water birds? That's really all I care about. Okay. Initially it was a period of intense hunting, really intense hunting. Massive destruction of numbers of birds. Then, by the late 19th century, a whole reversal. We want swans back on Perth water. Where do we get them from? Victoria. Makes sense. What we're seeing now, though, is quite different. Then, of course, there was a period of habitat loss, big-scale habitat loss. You tidy up the natural shoreline, replace it with concrete walls, all your habitat's gone, or much of it's gone. Since the 1960s, which was the last phase of habitat loss, really, which was the Narrows interchange, the sort of issues have changed to matters of disturbance, and water birds really don't cope well with high levels of human activity in their habitat. So disturbance is an issue. For water birds, water quality on the Swan River probably isn't as much an issue as it is, say, for aquatic organisms, for fully aquatic organisms. Still potentially a problem. I'm sorry about the pun there, I should have got rid of that, but sea level change, it is a problem, and I'll get on to more of that later. It doesn't, whether you can, I'm not going to get into the argument about man-induced or not, but sea level change is happening, it's rising, and it's a problem. And we're now seeing proposals for habitat enhancement to bring water birds and other wildlife back onto the river. And that's where I have actually been asked with respect to this development, well, how do we get swans in there as well? So what's happened? Just very briefly, because I've only got 6.5 minutes left. There have been some catastrophic declines of waterbirds on the river. This is another migratory bird, sharp-tailed sandpiper. Up until the early 60s, many thousands on the Swan River. If you can find 30 on Swan River today, you're doing really well. That was largely because of narrows interchange. They liked samphire marsh as a habitat. Narrows interchange was basically samphire marsh, and all the other bits that have gone before. The bits of the swan that I'm interested in are actually not the ones that we're talking about today so much, but the marine parks in the greater body of Melville water, of course, away from that spot there. But it's all related. That's the really important thing about water birds, is that they move around a lot. If there was one part of the estuary system that determines how many water birds you have on the entire system, it's this place here, after the cove, alongside a rubbish tip. You still find bits of rubbish sticking out through the mud. But it's one of the best places for water birds on the Swan River. And if what happens there affects what happens elsewhere, and the swans are a good example. A bit of control of disturbance here has resulted in an increase in swans at this point, and now we're actually seeing black swans pop up all over the place on the river we haven't seen for decades. A few things about waterbird biology which makes my life hard in trying to understand them and study them. They're highly mobile. Well, they're birds. They move between Alfred Cove, Pelican Point and Milieu on a daily basis driven by tides. They really like low tide periods because that's when they can access either mudflats or shallows. Swans, for example, graze on the halo fillet, the seagrass that grows in Melville water. They need shallow water to graze on that. That's where the climate change, sea level rise starts coming in. And they move, it's not just, the site on the Swan River isn't a site in isolation. They move between there to the lakes on Loch-Ness, to the lakes down near Mandurah, the estuary at Mandurah, and they move in a couple of hours. These birds could do 100 and something kilometres an hour in flight. That's not very long for them to go down to Mandurah for an afternoon and then come back again. Highly mobile things. And they're distracted by cyclonic rains. I mention that because we count these birds every year and try to make something of the numbers. You get a good cyclone going through and they all pick up their ears or their ultrasonic sensors or something and disappear for the next 6 months and reappear somewhere near Kalgoorlie. It's very frustrating. Okay, disturbance is by far the biggest issue now. And this is all going somewhere. Oh, I've got 2 minutes. Lots of disturbance problems for the birds on the river, but the biggest one by far is just people walking. I won't leave that up very long because I haven't got much time. We did a study some years ago around the river and found the biggest cause of problems for birds was just people walking, because there's so many people walking, because people like to get near the river. There's one person scaring birds. That's a big issue. I'm going to skip through that one. Some quick numbers. What happens to numbers of water birds on the Swan River in its entirety over a nice long period of time? Curlew sandpiper, they've gone. Great knot, that's almost gone. The fence at Alfred Cove has improved things for some birds, and that, you think this project's controversial. There were death threats over that fence. And black swans really like that fence. Unfortunately, no one bothered to count black swans because the people who count water birds like sharp-tailed sandpipers and redneck stints, not swans. Sea level rise. This is the little redneck stint. It's a ram's ass like redneck stint. It's got very short legs. A 5 centimetre sea level rise and it can't feed anymore. So it's pretty much gone from, big numbers. Sea level rise is good for some things. Oyster catchers are a marine species. Estuary is getting more marine. I'm going to skip to that. Okay. Now we've had the habitat abuse, we've had disturbance or having disturbance, sea level rise, and we've got some big issues. But we've got this underlying interest. I wanted to get to this slide before I get gone, because note the date, 1889. I'll let you read that quickly. If any of our politicians want to get a statue of themselves anywhere, this is obviously the way to do it, according to the West Australian 111 years ago. There's actually this real desire to get water birds back into the system. And that's where we actually get back to the Perth Waterfront. There's a desire for birds. The Perth Waterfront is not a landscape or a habitat that's going to be fantastic for birds. I'm sorry, it's small and it's closed and it's cramped and it's deep and it's got sharp banks. So to be really controversial, since I'm told that's what people like to do sometimes, if you actually want water birds as part of the Perth Waterfront, you've actually got to create what they need nearby. And that's, in fact, a shallows or mudflats area out in the middle of Perth water. So how's that for a controversial note on which to conclude?
Thanks, Mike. I'm just going to invite all three of our speakers to come up and face the music, face the audience. We'll have a little chat. Is that okay for your eyes? Okay, who wants to start? Any takers? Lucia.
Yes, I just wanted to about the island in the middle of the Swan River. If they took the esplanade soil and dumped it in somewhere, would it actually stay there, or would it drift away with the tides? And
I'm a biologist. I guess that suggestion I made is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I thought I'd throw it out there. And if there's a marine engineer who could look at the currents and substrate and stuff and say, yes, it would stay there, or it wouldn't, and that's the next question. Yeah.
We'll make it I think they've got a problem with what they dig out there. They're going to have to ship it away because it's mostly, it's muck.
Heavy
And
toxic asbestos.
all sorts of stuff. I don't think.
Who else wants to
There have been many plans over the years for an island in the middle of Perth water. It's come up with several.
And why does it get knocked back?
Just the cost and the difficulty of dredging. I think Perth's always had problems with its dredges.
We have someone over here.
I was just an observation. Obviously, the current plans are going ahead as a result of Perth being the capital of Western Australia, and there's a vast area that needs administration. So obviously, there's a shortage of office buildings and those kind of developments. What would you say to the idea that this is maybe a necessary evil in this one place in order to support that kind of development?
You asking me? I don't think that's necessarily the case, because at the same time we're building a whole lot of new office developments at the North Bridge Link. So, and there's a lot of underused land around Perth. It's very low density. I mean, some of the aerial photographs you'll see. I don't think it's necessary to do that in that volume, in that location. I'm not saying don't do anything. That's not that they shouldn't do anything, but not in such volume, in such a location. Does that answer your question?
Because it really will cut off people from the river and the city from the river because of the size of the buildings. Because as it is now, we come down to lower buildings in the esplanade, and then suddenly you don't have higher buildings.
It seems like most of the people I talk to are against the idea of what the current proposal is, and yet that's what's going ahead. And like we've got places like your organisations that are to my mind coming up with better ideas. How is it that we're stuck with this thing that's going ahead when the vast majority of people don't really want it? They want something else. They want something that's like where there's more land there, where there's those tall buildings, you know, and we've got this idea that the land is precious there, sure, but what we're doing is putting the water into the land that we've already got, making less land. And the idea, I think, of actually like going out into the river is a much better idea, and creating mudflats, like from a construction point of view, to get something to stay there, that's not that hard to do. Places like Singapore have done it, and you know, Hong Kong, everywhere, it wouldn't be that difficult to do.
Yes.
So like, has the horse bolted? Can we
well, it has to an extent, because they started digging out there today. You'll be pleased to know. I can't see it. I can see perhaps common sense. I mean, cutting Riverside Drive, for example, is going to be like strangling Perth. It's not just one road. There's no alternative. Some people may not agree with that, but if you look at the broader picture, it's like this. It's like squeezing somebody's throat dry. So I think that will come back. I think that issue will revive itself. And then the other issue which will modify is that there's going to be a lot of land developed on the market, and it won't be developed. Look how long it took for the BHP site to be developed. I mean, they had a lot of legal issues and one thing and another, but the demand for those huge buildings that are located in this design is just, you know, pretty rare. Now, they might have one or two people who might want to buy them, but that, my guess is that land will stay vacant for a long, long time, and it will get up people's noses. It will be a development site, and people won't like it. And when the road gets cut, they won't like that either. So maybe there'll be a shift in policy around it. But other than that,
how does the height of those proposed buildings dovetail with what you were showing us? Like you had this step back idea of is like those new buildings. Are they like way above that line?
They're up 36, up to 36 stories high, and the ground is going to be, from what I can understand, 6 stories of car park, and then the buildings rise above it. So it won't be very attractive, either on the ground or in the shadows that it throws.
Isn't there like sort of 6 stories of massive buildings and then a step back to the tall buildings?
Deck car park, from what I can see.
It's just car park. I thought it was a building.
Right, that's not the case.
No, right? Okay,
No.
perhaps.
There's a three, I mean, there's a three, they've just released the design guidelines.
Okay.
There's a 3 to 5 story podium, and then there's the height of the building above there, and they're
So
set
it
back.
is 36
And they're
stories.
not, they're all different heights.
Okay.
All different heights.
Okay, so I'm mistaken about that. Yeah, about the 6 stories.
But they have to be active facades, so they're not a blank car park.
Okay, so active facades means shops.
Shops and stuff like
Okay,
that. I
so
mean,
that's not quite as bad
that's
as
the
I
draft
tried.
guide, that's the draft guidelines.
Okay, but they're still tall.
Yeah. I've got a question. I wonder, you know, Sue, you showed a beautiful photograph, you know, plan there, with no esplanade fill, right? When the colony was first settled. I wonder what would happen today if we didn't have the esplanade and we were back to where the original shoreline was, and someone come up with a wonderful idea to fill the Swan River. I would suspect there would be a huge fight about that. I'm not arguing for or against, but I think I've been around 40 years in all these sorts of projects. I've never seen any project ever go anywhere that didn't have an enormous amount of controversy. And I refer you to Hillary's Boat Harbour, which happens to be now one of the most attractive places where people from Perth and visitors go. That is going to, if you look at the history of that, that was going to silt up the Indian Ocean, you name it. It was all the things. None of the things that was predicted to happen, happened. And now it's there. I think I've watched for 30 years the argument about bringing the city to the water to the city. I've listened to the arguments 1,000 times. No matter where you decide to build an inlet, you would have a fight. So I've actually said, ultimately, somewhere, someplace, they're going to bring the water to the city, or the city to the water, and if someone's made a decision, that's where it is. What I suspect, or what I suggest, is that that decision's been made, so you're not going to reverse it. But what I do encourage people is to get involved in the design guidelines for these buildings that surround the inlet. You can make an impact on those. They are out for public comment, and I encourage everybody to make a comment about it. I tend to agree with Ralph. The land has always been in public ownership. Do we really need to get, as public, we own it, do we really need to get a return on investment? It's ours. Now, I think what's happened is it's driven by governments that say everything's got to be cost neutral. Now, that's what I thought governments were supposed to do, provide great public places. And I'm not sure that personally I need a return on investment.
Okay, thank you, William. If anyone wants to chat about that further, I'd invite you guys to do that afterwards. I think over here we have somebody wanted to say
Well,
something.
in the presentation, I think it was mainly yours, Ralph, transport is highlighted as an issue, but I think as is common in Perth, the focus seems to be on the cars. Now, I know that the river is also used a lot to cycle around, walk around. I have looked at some of the details and I'm really concerned about that. I've talked to my Yorker just about the different modes of transport, not just cars and public transport, but walking, cycling.
Cycling, well, there was a question asked in the upper house about the cycling, and the current cycleway across in front of it will be, I think, from what I understand, the answer was given, that it will be cut. So the bike path and I guess the footpath will go back onto the road, which is a bit of a shame.
Well, I think especially considering that research has shown it's the busiest intersection for cyclists in Perth. It's used a lot to get from east to west. I have corresponded with, I don't even know all the different bodies, but basically the answer that I get back is, well, you just need to ride around the inlet, which I don't know how many extra traffic lights and intersections that's going to add to my journey with all the, I guess, unsafety that comes with it. But yeah, I think it just needs to be highlighted because the focus is very much on what is it going to do for cars getting into the city and out of the city, but there's people that get around on other ways of transport as well.
That's true. It's also supposed to be for the ferries coming across from South Perth. It's supposed to increase the use of ferries, which wouldn't be a bad thing in itself, but it will cut the bike path.
Somebody had said that when the ferries will take longer because they've got to get into the inlet.
Take twice as long.
It will take twice as long, so people won't be so encouraged. And also, ferries will have to install toilets. Is that true? Because if you're on a ferry for more than somebody said that the other night.
The guys who run the ferries say that something like that. It now takes 6 minutes to go from South Perth. It will take roughly 12 minutes, and then they have to turn around. If they take up to 15 minutes, then they have to do that.
Put toilets in. Yeah,
but they also may have to increase trees. I don't know the details. That's a minor one.
Over here?
Can I just ask, if there's a change in government, is there like the propensity for this to be changed around again so that it'll go back and there'll be a new plan, or will it just go ahead anyway? What will happen if there's a change in government?
Well, the previous government invented this idea. They're sort of caught in a bit of a loop. Nevertheless, I think from what I've heard and spoken to some of the other Labor Party people, they are much more aware of the issues that are raised by this development than they were when they first proposed it. But they're in a difficult position.
Right, okay.
I seem to remember at some point mention of Riverside Drive being sunk underground.
Well, that has been mentioned as an option. You know, I think Mr. Barnett said, well, one day we can sink it. I've spoken to some very senior engineers about, well, two reasons. One thing is, why would you want to sink this beautiful Riverside Boulevard in the first place? Why would you want to put it under? Second of all, the cost will be enormous. Unbelievably expensive.
I can tell. I investigated. We were involved in the bell tower. We investigated a tunnel underneath for the court tunnel. It's a huge cost, and secondly, the nasty bits that no one thinks about is the entry down and the entry up, and you're just sort of going down a hole and coming out a hole, and just the length of going down and up to accommodate cars is very long. It's sort of not a good solution.
I suggest a bridge, but nobody wants to do that.
Does anyone else want to?
This is a question that relates to one of the previous questions, and that is, you mentioned, you mentioned that if we cut off the main Riverside Drive road, that would essentially strangle the city. Does that not represent a bigger issue, that if you cut off one major road, then actually you're crippling the city?
Well,
should we be looking at a more robust transport strategy for all modes of transport through that area?
You should definitely be looking at increased and the government is looking at increased expenditure and investment in public transport, no doubt about it. But Riverside Drive has no alternative, and I don't think it's really understood the effect that cutting that road will be. They say, well, you can go in the tunnel or what have you, but the tunnel is a bypass only. Because Riverside Drive, apart from being a very attractive road to drive on, has access into the eastern part of the city and across from West Perth and backwards and forwards. Whereas now that they've narrowed down the inner city, like the CBD now has a bus lane, so there's only one lane in St George's Terrace and only one lane in Newcastle Street. It's getting too tight and too strong. So you must have a balanced system, absolutely.
So surely on that basis then that a development strategy for transport should go hand in hand with the development strategy for Riverfront.
As I tried to say there, with all this increase in land use, you know, with lots more office workers in that location, the system is going to be overwhelmed. Not just there, but also in the North Virginia as well. The system won't cope, and it's not coping now. So they really do need to spend much more money on infrastructure, absolutely true, but don't forget roads, because people do still drive around.
Up the back here?
Sorry, I did want to clarify with regard to cutting off Riverside Drive. Having looked at the plan, I think the Riverside Drive, to say it's cut off is slightly incorrect in that they're building a new Riverside Drive with, if you imagine the Esplanade Park as it is now, cuts about 50% of the way through it. So it's not as if the traffic would be redirected onto existing roads as much as directed around. And having looked at the maps, the comparison I thought was useful was that the distance that you would be driving around in the redirection was about 50% more than the Horseshoe Bridge. So it's a redirection, but I was actually against the plan until I realised that it wasn't actually putting it back onto the Esplanade Road. There's a separate Riverside Drive that's being rebuilt, so it's a redirection.
Well, can I just explain to you? You'll come along Riverside Drive. Let's say you're coming from east to west. You'll come along Riverside Drive and you'll come to Barrack Street, traffic lights. You'll turn right, and you'll have a choice. You'll be able to go on the new road, which will be traffic calm, so you won't be able to be very local, or back up to the Esplanade itself, the current Esplanade Road, traffic lights. Then new traffic lights at the two streets that come down, Howard Street and the other one, Sherwood Court. So traffic light, and traffic light at William Street, and you turn right again, you'll turn left again. You will go bananas. And so, the length may be, as you suggest, and Mr. Barnett suggested the same thing in the Subiaco Post the other day, but you will go nuts. You will try to avoid that because you'll be trying to take your kids to school, or you'll be trying to go and visit the grandmother, or whatever you're doing, not just a journey to work. And you'll avoid it.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue that.
Ralph, I've driven that in peak hour, and I've come along Barrack Street, gone up Barrack Street, along the terrace and down in peak hour, and it took me 7 minutes. Because I listened to this argument, and I thought, well, I'm going to do a dog lead and just see how long it took in the peak hour.
Look,
Maybe
it's
cook
going to be
lots.
twice as many.
7 minutes it took me, and I had to stop at lights. You know, I think it's going to take longer, for sure.
Especially when you factor in the people who are trying to get in and out of those car parks.
Okay, well, I think that it's probably time to wrap up. So I would like to invite each of our panelists if they want to just make any final statements or conclude in any way. Now would be a good time to do it. Otherwise, we can wrap up.
I'm not saying any more, but I've said a lot. But I'd like to invite anyone who's interested to have a look at just remind you of the citygatekeepers.com.au website. They cover a lot of these issues, and you might find it interesting to get a bit more insight into what's going on.
All the publicity we see for this development, talk about how we've got to get into the 21st century, think about the future, and be a modern city. But in fact, if we're destroying our heritage to do that, I think we're not actually meeting those criteria. We can actually do a development that incorporates the heritage and the history instead of, it's a very, very important heritage site, and I think there's an opportunity to do something clever, but we're not doing that.
I guess my only comment is what I said at the end of my talk was that whatever happens at that point, Perth's had a strong desire to keep its water birds on Perth water, and whatever gets done there is an opportunity to do something to create water bird habitat, whether it's by Little Island or something. There's an opportunity there, and it's not currently in the plan, and it would be nice if there was something there for the original inhabitants.
Okay, well, thank you guys so much for coming tonight, and Central Institute of Technology would also like to thank you, and they've got a little gift here, which I'll give to you on your way out. And I want to thank everyone here for coming. Wouldn't be much of a Perth Green Drinks without you all. And let's go outside now and continue the conversation and get to know each other a bit more and have a drink. And if you haven't already joined our email list and you want to get information about future events, let myself or Flavia know. We can put you on the list. And don't forget to like us on Facebook.